The night of my father's retirement party, I stood in the kitchen of my parents' house in Naperville, cutting a lemon cake into careful slices, and I told myself everything was fine. The house smelled like it always did. My mother's pot roast in the oven, the faint cedar from the hallway closet, decades of ordinary life soaked into the walls. My husband, Connor, was in the living room laughing at something my uncle said. My mother-in-law, Sylvia, was perched on the good armchair in the corner. The one nobody usually sits in, watching everything with that smile she has. The one that doesn't quite reach her eyes. I should have paid more attention to that smile. My father, Ray, had spent 31 years as a structural engineer for the city of Chicago. He was retiring at 64, healthy, proud, ready to finally fix the deck out back and take my mother on the trip to Portugal they'd been talking about since I was in middle school. That party was supposed to be a celebration. 70 people, a rented event space at the Marriott 2 miles from the house, the chicken marsala he specifically requested, a slideshow my younger brother Theo put together of 31 years of job sites and bad haircuts. It was supposed to be a good night. Connor and I had been married for 3 years. We met at a friend's 4th of July barbecue, talked until the fireworks were over and the mosquitoes got bad, and by the time I drove home I already knew he was someone I wanted to keep knowing. He was warm and funny, and he remembered things. The name of my childhood dog, the city where my grandmother grew up, the coffee order I mentioned once and never repeated. He was the kind of man who made you feel seen. At least that's who I thought he was. His mother, Sylvia, came with the package. She lived 40 minutes away in Hinsdale in a house that was too big for one person and decorated like a magazine spread that nobody actually lives in. She had opinions about everything, my curtains, my haircut, the way I loaded the dishwasher, but she delivered them all in this pleasant, helpful tone that made it hard to push back without looking unreasonable. Connor thought she was just particular, his word. I thought particular was a generous word for it, but I loved him, so I kept my mouth shut and learned to navigate around her. The first 2 years of our marriage, things were livable. She was overbearing in the way I'd expected, no worse. Connor and I had our own rhythms, our own life, our own apartment in Evanston with the bay window that caught the afternoon light. I was a financial analyst at a consulting firm downtown. I liked my work. I was good at it. I made more than Connor knew because early on I'd learned that money was something Sylvia had very specific feelings about, and those feelings tended to land on me in uncomfortable ways. Then my grandfather passed, and everything shifted. My grandfather, my mother's father, was a man named August, which suited him perfectly because he was warm and generous and a little overwhelming in the best possible way. He'd built a small real estate business in the northwest suburbs over 40 years, starting with a duplex he bought in 1979 and eventually managing a portfolio of rental properties that surprised everyone in the family when the estate was finally settled. He left the majority of it to my mother and her 2 sisters. But he left something to me specifically, separate, because he said once that I was the one who reminded him most of himself. He left me a stake in 3 commercial properties in the western suburbs, fully managed, mostly hands-off, generating reliable income. It wasn't a number I talked about. I had a separate account. I had an attorney named Patrick who handled the property management side. My mother knew. Theo knew. Connor did not. I know how that sounds, and I'll explain why in a minute. About 8 months before my father's retirement party, things with Sylvia started changing in a way I couldn't quite name. She started asking questions about our finances that felt probing rather than curious, whether we were thinking about real estate, whether I had any investments, whether my family had money tied up somewhere. Connor mentioned offhandedly that his mother had some financial difficulties after his father's death years ago and had been talking to a financial advisor. I thought nothing of it. Then the suggestions started. It began with a dinner. Sylvia floated the idea of us pooling resources as a family to buy a vacation property together, somewhere in Michigan. She mentioned it would make more sense if Connor and I contributed the majority since we were at that stage in life. Connor nodded along. I said we'd think about it. A month later, she mentioned a business idea she had. something about a boutique she wanted to open, and how a family loan would be more personal than going to a bank. Connor brought it up to me later that week, gently, like he was asking for something small. I said we didn't have that kind of liquidity. He looked at me a little strangely. Then in January, 4 months before the party, Sylvia told Connor, not me, Connor, that she had consulted with her financial advisor and determined that the most tax-advantage way to handle her estate planning was to have Connor and me put significant assets in a joint trust. A joint trust with her. She presented him with a document, a formal, attorney-drafted document. Connor told me about it over dinner on a Tuesday like it was a logistical matter we needed to sort out. He slid the document across the table. He'd already read it. He said he thought it made sense. I picked it up. I read 2 pages. I put it down. The document would have required me to transfer a substantial portion of my assets into a trust that Connor and Sylvia would co-manage. The language around my rights to those assets was thin at best. Buried in Section 4 was a clause that would give Sylvia effective veto power over any distribution from the trust for the first 10 years. 10 years. She would have had access to income generated by property my grandfather built over a lifetime, property he left specifically to me, and I would have needed her sign-off to touch any of it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I sat there for a moment and looked at my husband and said, "Who is this for? Her or us?" He said he thought we were all family. I said I'd look it over more carefully. I didn't sign it. Weeks passed. Sylvia would mention it occasionally at Sunday dinners, little references like she was just keeping it warm. Connor would look at me and I would look back and I would say we were still reviewing it. He started to get quiet about it, then frustrated. Then one night in March he said that his mother was dealing with a lot of financial stress and this arrangement would help stabilize things for everyone. And there it was. It wasn't estate planning. It was a rescue operation, and I was the asset. I didn't confront him then. I want to be clear about that. I thought carefully about what I needed to know before I said anything. I called Patrick, my property attorney. I called my own financial advisor. I talked to Theo, who had a law degree he mostly used to review contracts for a tech company, but who I trusted completely. I spent 6 weeks gathering information quietly because I needed to understand exactly what was on the table before I responded to it. What I found made my stomach drop. Sylvia had taken out a home equity line of credit on her Hinsdale house, nearly $200,000 over 3 years, and the money was largely gone. She'd made a series of investments through a financial advisor who, it turned out, was not a fiduciary and had steered her into high-commission products that hadn't performed. She had also, Theo found through some careful research, been funding a business venture for a man she'd been seeing quietly for about 18 months. A man who was no longer in the picture, but whose business ventures had absorbed a significant amount of Sylvia's money before he disappeared from her life. Connor knew she was in trouble. What I didn't know, until I thought hard about the timing, was how long he'd known and what he'd been doing with that information. He'd been waiting. He had been waiting for my grandfather to pass, for the inheritance to land, for me to become the solution. I want to be fair to him. I don't know for certain that he thought it through that coldly. Maybe he told himself it was just family helping family. Maybe he genuinely believed I would see it that way if he just presented it right. But he had never told me. He'd had 8 months of knowing his mother was in serious financial trouble, and he had never sat down with me and said, "I need to tell you something hard." He had let his mother draft the document. He had slid it across the dinner table on a Tuesday. He had treated it like paperwork. The retirement party fell on the 2nd Friday of May. By then, I had made my decision. I hadn't told Connor. I want to explain that. I know it looks deliberate, and it was, partly, but it was also because every time I tried to find the right moment to have the real conversation, I'd look at him and I'd see the man I married and I'd lose my nerve. I needed to be somewhere that wasn't our apartment, somewhere with people around me, somewhere I felt steady. And then the party arrived, and my father looked so happy, and my mother was in the blue dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion. And Theo was making jokes about the slideshow, and I thought, this is not the night. But Sylvia made it the night. It happened during the dinner portion, before the speeches, while the tables were still full and the noise level was ambient and comfortable. I was coming back from the restroom, and I passed the small hallway near the event room's side bar, and I heard Sylvia's voice. She was on the phone. I don't think she heard me approach. She was telling whoever was on the other end that it would all be settled soon, that Connor had handled it, that once the paperwork was done, the funds would be accessible. She used a specific number, the approximate annual income generated by my properties, which I had never told her, and which she could only have gotten from Connor, who could only have gotten it by going through my files. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. I went back to the table. I sat down next to my mother. She put her hand on mine because she's my mother and she knows my face, and she asked quietly if I was okay. I said yes. I picked up my water glass. I looked across the room at my husband, who was laughing at something my father said, his hand relaxed on the tablecloth, completely at ease. And I thought, I have spent 6 weeks preparing for this, and I am tired of waiting. After the main course, before Theo's speech, the event coordinator asked if anyone else wanted to say a few words. It was an open invitation. This was that kind of party, informal, a celebration of a man everyone loved. I raised my hand. Connor looked over at me with a surprised, pleased smile. He thought I was going to toast my father. I walked to the front of the room. The coordinator handed me the microphone. I looked out at the table where my parents were sitting, my father in the charcoal blazer he'd bought new for the occasion, my mother in her blue dress. I looked at Theo. I looked at Connor, who was watching me with that warm expression, still not understanding. I looked at Sylvia, who was smiling the way she always smiles, the particular one. And I said, I have a few things I want to share tonight, and I apologize in advance because some of this is going to be a little more personal than you are expecting from a retirement toast. There was a light laugh in the room. My father looked curious. I thanked my father first, and I meant every word of it. I talked about what it meant to grow up watching a man build something honest, work with his hands and his mind, put his name on structures that would still be standing after he was gone. I talked about what it had taught me, about the value of things you build yourself, the things nobody can take from you unless you let them. I watched my father's face and I saw him get a little misty. And I meant that part too. Then I said I had a brief announcement of a more personal nature that I'd been meaning to share with my family, and I thought tonight, of all nights, felt like the right time. I had asked Patrick to prepare a short summary document. 1 page. Clear language, no jargon. I had printed 20 copies and asked a server I'd tipped generously before dinner to hold them and bring them to the tables when I nodded. I nodded. The server began moving through the room. I explained that I'd inherited a real estate stake from my grandfather, that it had been generating income for the past 2 years, and that on the advice of my attorney, I had recently completed the process of moving those assets into an irrevocable trust in my name only, with clearly defined protections against any third-party claims. I said I was sharing this because I believed in transparency with my family and because some recent events had made me realize that people I trusted had information about my finances that I had never shared with them, and had been making plans based on that information without my knowledge or consent. The room had gone very quiet. I said I also wanted to share that I had, earlier that week, spoken with an attorney about my options going forward, and that I had made some decisions that I would be discussing with my husband in private. What I would not be doing, and I said this clearly, calmly, in the voice I use for client presentations, was signing any document that transferred control of my grandfather's legacy to anyone else. Not now, not in restructured form, not with different language, not ever. I looked at Sylvia when I said that last part. Her smile had gone away. Connor's face had changed entirely. He looked confused first, then alarmed, and then something else, something that looked uncomfortably like court. I thanked everyone again for celebrating my father, handed the microphone back to the coordinator, and walked to the table where my mother was sitting. She stood up and hugged me without saying anything. My father put his hand on my back. Theo looked at me with the expression he's had since we were kids when I've done something he considers exactly right. Connor came to me 20 minutes later, near the bar, and asked if we could talk. I said yes, but not here and not tonight. I said we should let my father have his party. He looked at me for a long moment and then he nodded and went back to the table. The rest of the evening proceeded. Theo gave his speech. There was dancing. My father had 2 whiskies and declared it the best night he'd had in years, which made me both happy and ache a little because I'd complicated his party, even if I'd tried to protect it as much as I could. My mother danced with him to an old Sinatra song the DJ found on request, and I stood at the edge of the room and watched them and thought about what it means to build 30 years with someone. Really build it with honesty and care. Sylvia left early. She came to say goodbye to my parents, skipped me, and walked out with her coat and her purse and her smile tucked away somewhere I couldn't see it. Connor and I drove home in near silence. He tried once on the highway to begin a sentence, and I said I wasn't ready to talk yet, and he went quiet again. We talked 3 days later. A long, terrible conversation that I'm not going to reconstruct here because some things deserve to stay private, even in hindsight. What I will say is that Connor didn't deny it. He said he had thought he was protecting his mother. He said he had planned to tell me eventually. He said the number Sylvia had, the income figure, he'd found in a document I'd left on my desk when I was working from home. He said he hadn't meant for it to become what it became. I believe that he hadn't intended to hurt me. I also believe that intentions don't cover the distance between what he did and what I needed from a partner. He had taken information that wasn't his. He had handed it to his mother. He had let her draft documents and sit on plans for months while he said nothing. When I had tried to push back, he had told me it was family. He had not once asked me what I wanted. I couldn't get past that. We separated in July. It was quiet, as these things go. No screaming, no attorneys fighting over things, no dramatic scenes. My grandfather's trust was protected. Patrick had made sure of that. The apartment in Evanston was a lease, so that was simple. Connor moved out in early August. We were civil, in the way that people are civil, when they've decided that the kindest thing left to do is make it clean. I heard, through my mother, who hears these things, that Sylvia sold the Hinsdale house in September. She moved closer to Connor, into something smaller. I don't know what happened with the financial advisor or the man who'd taken her money. I don't wish her harm. I genuinely don't. I just no longer have any obligation to be her solution. My father's deck is finished now. He sent me photos in October. The new boards, the 2 Adirondack chairs he found at an estate sale, the view of the backyard in the last of the fall colour. He and my mother are going to Portugal in the spring. They've had the trip planned so long that the guidebook my mother bought is out of date, but she's using it anyway. I'm back in Evanston, different apartment, same bay window light. I have dinners with Theo on Thursdays. I go to my parents' house most Sundays. I work on things I care about. I check in with Patrick once a quarter, and the properties are steady and quiet, and mine. Last month, I was going through some old boxes I hadn't unpacked since the move, and I found a birthday card my grandfather gave me when I turned 22, the year I graduated. He'd written inside, in his slow, emphatic handwriting, "The best thing I ever did was build something nobody could take from me. You'll know what that means someday." I sat with that card for a while. I think I know what it means now. I keep coming back to the birthday card, the one my grandfather wrote in that slow, deliberate handwriting, the year I turned 22. He didn't give advice often. He was more of a show you kind of man than a tell you kind. But that card was the exception. Build something nobody can take from you. I didn't fully understand it then. I thought he meant property, assets, the practical things. I understand now that he meant something harder to quantify. What happened with Connor and Sylvia taught me things I didn't go looking for. The first is about honesty, not the easy kind, the kind you perform when stakes are low, but the kind that costs you something. Connor was not a dishonest man in the broad strokes of his life. He was warm and thoughtful in 100 small ways, But when it mattered most, when he found information that wasn't his and made plans he never disclosed, he chose the easier path. He chose to manage the situation rather than respect me enough to be straight with me. That gap between the man he was in ordinary life and the man he became under pressure, that's where the marriage actually ended. Long before the party, long before the microphone, I spent a lot of time angry about that. Then I spent time being honest with myself about my own part in it. I had kept my finances private from my husband, and I had reasons, but reasons aren't the same as wisdom. I should have built more transparency between us earlier, should have created the kind of foundation where financial conversations weren't loaded. I didn't. So when the pressure came, there was no foundation to hold. The second thing I learned is about clear thinking when your emotions are loudest. The weeks after I found out, when I was sitting with the document, with Patrick, with Theo, gathering information quietly instead of reacting, those weeks were the hardest of my adult life. Everything in me wanted to confront Connor immediately, wanted to demand an explanation, wanted to make the feelings stop. But I knew that reacting from that place would only make me reactive, it would make me easier to dismiss. So I waited. I built the irrevocable trust first. I understood the full picture first. And when I finally did speak at a microphone in front of 70 people, I spoke from a position of clarity rather than injury. That's the only reason it landed the way it did. The third thing is simpler to say and harder to live. You have to be willing to lose what you love if keeping it requires you to become someone smaller than you are. I loved Connor. I loved the life we were building. Walking away from that was not a relief. It was a real loss, and I felt it as a real loss, and I still do sometimes on quiet evenings when the apartment is too still. But the alternative was to let fear make the decision for me, to sign the document, to absorb the cost, to tell myself it wasn't that bad. I know myself well enough to know that version of me, the one who chose comfort over integrity, would not have survived it intact. My grandfather built things, honest things, durable things, things that outlasted the circumstances of any given year. I think about that when I check the quarterly reports, when I see the property still standing, still generating, still mine. He understood something that took me longer to learn, that the most important structures aren't the ones other people can see. They're the ones you build inside yourself, quietly before you ever need them. I needed mine. I'm glad I've been building it all along.